All right, I will call the Capital Planning Committee to order. Monday, November 9th, 2020 is 7:32 p.m. Pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the Open Meeting Law, General Law, Chapter 38, Section 18, and the Governor's March 15, 2020 order imposing strict limitation on the number of people that may gather in one place, this meeting of the Southborough Capital Planning Committee will be conducted via remote participation to the greatest extent possible. Specific information in the general guidelines for remote participation by members of the public and/or parties with a right and/or requirement to attend this meeting can be found on the Town of Southborough's website at www.southboroughtown.com. For this meeting, members of the public who wish to watch or participate in the meeting may do so in the following manner by finding the meeting at www.southboroughtown.com/remote meetings. No in-person attendance of members of the public will be permitted, but every effort will be made to ensure that the public can adequately access these proceedings in real time via technological means. In the event that we're unable to do so, despite best efforts, we will post on Southborough's website an audio or video recording, transcript, or other comprehensive recording of proceedings as soon as possible after the meeting. I will note that all committee members are present, and we will go right to approval of meeting minutes from October 22nd and October 27th. Start with October 22nd. Were there any comments? I believe these were circulated by Mr. Palmer.
I just have just a few minor comments.
Go ahead, Jeff.
First, in the approval of the meeting minutes, I would just recommend striking the word edited in front of the minutes because that would imply that there was some type of dialogue. I would just say minutes written by Mr. Pfaff and then minutes written by Mr. Hark, just to remove that. And then a couple more things, Joe. In the road maintenance or sidewalk maintenance section, I was the one that seconded it. There's no reference to who seconded the motion. So if you could just include that. And two more things. References to CPC. I think you're referring to the committee, but I would just change it to the committee rather than CPC. So that there's no confusion in terms of who we're referring to.
Yeah, I would say we need to not call ourselves CPC moving forward. That designation came before us. So we can either be full capital planning committee, we can define ourselves as committee, or we can call ourselves Capcom. I think what our email address is. I'm indifferent, but I do think I've gotten at least 2 emails asking why we've been called CPC. And I said, no one called us that. So
what are our 2 choices? Capcom and what else?
Or spelling out capital planning.
The full name?
Or we can just say the committee because we call ourselves.
Yeah, if you define it, right? If it's a defined term in the minutes, then.
Right.
Other towns call it the Capital Improvement Planning Committee. Or the
We
CIP.
used to call it the Capital Budget Committee too. And it's predecessor.
All good things to think about if this becomes a standing committee, if we want to change the name.
Let's not spend a whole lot of time on this.
Jeff,
Just
did you have anything else?
Yeah, just the last thing in that, the last paragraph of section 3. Joe, I asked if meeting minutes would be required, and then Jason confirmed it. I did not confirm that they were required for the board selecting meeting.
You answered your own question.
I'm good like that. That's
All
all.
right, anything else, Jeff?
No.
Any other members? Joe, in terms of the formatting, I know you're using a different software than Word. Is that correct? When you type these up? So,
yeah, it converts it into a Word program, but that doesn't mean it's exactly the same.
Okay. So I guess once you, with the indulgence of the committee, once you make those edits, assuming everyone approves of those, I'll just take it and put it in the same format when I submit it to the clerk that all the others are in. I know you can't replicate it in different software, but
I'll make the edits and send it over.
okay. Everyone's good with that, getting them consistent. Okay. Any other discussion on the 22nd meeting minutes? So I will move that we accept the October 22nd, 2020 meeting minutes as with the edits proposed by Mr. Hark. Is there a second?
Second.
Any further conversation? All right, roll call. Braccio.
Aye.
Cook.
Aye.
Hark.
Aye.
Palmer.
Aye.
Pfaff,
Aye.
and Malinowski is aye. All right, then we go to the 27th, which Andrew sent around. Were there any questions on those?
Jason, I just need your final presentation to attach, or you'll attach it when you send it in.
Yeah, when we send them in, I usually just take the attachments that were sent. So
You're good.
I thought it was great use of minutes that were already drafted. My only thing would say is, obviously, if I don't typically see a ton of corrections, Lisa, at the BOS meetings on the minutes. But if there are any material corrections on this, we'll revote it next time. But I think safe to assume that they're in good shape. Everything looked fine to me. But so, any other comments on those? All right, then I will move that we accept the October 27th, 2020 meeting minutes as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, seconded by, that was Jeff?
Yeah.
Okay, any further discussion? All right, roll call, Braccio,
Aye.
Cook,
Aye.
Hark.
Aye.
Palmer,
Aye.
and Pfaff is aye. Pfaff, sorry, I was going to Malinowski, but Pfaff
Aye.
and Malinowski is aye.
I wrote them, so I better approve.
Yeah. I was already looking at my screen to move to the next topic. I know it's later in the agenda, but Mr. Wood had a conflict come up like about an hour ago, so he's going to be unable to attend to talk about item 6, meeting with EDC regarding Route 9. So we're just going to push that to the next agenda when we get to that. So I will start with chairman's update. As all of you know, there's an executive session with the Board of Selectmen tomorrow night at 6 p.m. It will go absolutely no longer than a half an hour related to South Union School. As a reminder to those that have not been party to executive session discussions before, only those that are in those sessions are privy to the knowledge and the conversations that will happen there. While there will be minutes needed for the discussion, we will not discuss them until it's the proper time to release them in terms of actually the content of what's in it. So there won't be any public posting of that until we get to the time that the item has been dispensed of. So I would just say use extra caution, with any discussions around that, because given that it does deal with real property and it does have, happen under an exemption under the open meeting law, we'll just have to be cognizant of that and not blend it into any of our open meeting discussions until the time is appropriate. I don't know, Mark, if you have any other words of caution. A lot of us have been through it before, but given that we do have some members that have not been through it.
No, it's kind of like Vegas. What happens in executive session stays in executive session. That's really the overarching theme. That's
Until
really it.
the minutes are released.
Until the minutes are released, which would happen when the issue is completed, Kathy.
So I may be way behind here. Jason, where is the appraisal?
You're going to get it after the meeting, and that's on purpose to make sure it wasn't discussed during this meeting. So, and I'm going to move on from South Union unless anyone has anything else. Other things under chairman's update is coming out of our last meeting, which was joint with the Board of Selectmen. I took 2 takeaways, but would welcome anyone else's thoughts. One, I believe it came at the end when Mr. Healy talked about creating more of a standing committee as opposed to an ad hoc committee. So I think what we will want to do, and Kathy, this obviously dovetails into anything that advisory decides to do from a bylaw perspective, or I guess it's town code. We'll want to think about what language should be in any sort of motion or warrant article at town meeting if this is the direction that the Board of Selectmen decide to go this year. So Lisa, I don't know the timing of when you would need that from a warrant perspective, and if that is the board's intent this year, but I would imagine you would want some sort of referral from this committee of, the proper language. So I'm sure we'll leverage the charge et cetera. But I didn't want to lose sight of that comment, especially given that my guess the warrant closes a lot quicker than we think it does. Mark, is there anything to add there? Any thoughts on the process around that?
No, I think that's pretty clear, Jason.
Okay. So then on the budget process, so as you all know, we're obviously ahead of the game in terms of having some sort of consensus around the capital improvement articles that will likely be going forward to town meeting. But a lot of that was caution. I believe it was Mr. Shea that, talked a lot about, obviously we don't know what the overall budget picture of the town will be once we get through the operational aspects of it. And they obviously reserved, the ability to go back. So I think between, the BOS advisory members on this committee, we'll obviously keep everyone up to date if we see something trending not in the right direction that we may need to start making different decisions. But the goal is to kind of take the recommendations that we had and kind of keep them for FY22 and continue with our other work that we have to work through, in the meantime. And then finally, and this will dovetail into the next one, is the school capital planning subcommittee. So not our subcommittee related to the schools, but the school has their own capital. We're working through how to best meld that, longer term. They have officially voted based on a comment by Ms. Martin and the superintendent not to advance any of the NERI capital improvement articles for this town meeting. There still stands the possibility for funding that may be needed for the work that comes out of the subcommittee that Kathy and I are on, but we don't know what that is yet, and we won't know probably until much closer to town meeting. With that, I'm going to go right into 4, then I'll open it to questions. Just for a point of reference, so I don't repeat anything that anyone already knows, has anyone other than Kathy actually watched the school research subcommittee meetings?
Watch some of them, but not the last one.
Okay. So I'm going to do the best to summarize where we're at. As I mentioned in our last discussion, there was a more formal study that's now being undertaken by NESDEC, who does these studies around school enrollment. This was actually a step that, at least to my surprise, Kathy, and I believe you indicated surprise too, that was never taken back in 2013 in terms of a more formal projection of enrollment based on a lot more factors in town, like building permits that are being pulled, construction activity, birth, not just relying necessarily on birth rates and applying some sort of multiple. And that formal study will be in by the middle of January. So it's already underway. I know they've started to contact various town officials for the data that they need, but that's going to give us probably the best data we're ever going to have about a 10-year enrollment projection, and goes beyond the standard reports that NESDEC provides to the schools on a regular basis based on their actual enrollment. So that is underway, but I think where our last meeting went was we weren't going to focus, we didn't want to just stop work for 2 months while we waited for that, because it became abundantly apparent that there were more factors beyond just the enrollment data that would ultimately help to land where this goes in terms of, do you consolidate your schools or not? There's a lot of educational aspects to it that, if you're interested in that, I just ask you to go back and watch the meeting or look at the minutes once that set gets approved, because that was discussed last week. But the one thing that relates to this committee, I'm going to throw out a scenario that I think we need to start thinking about starting tonight, is the schools may decide, or the enrollment data may dictate, you don't have to consolidate. You don't need to consolidate schools, or there's really no major need, because based on the data, you need the space that you have. But there are also educational reasons to potentially consolidate schools. And the main reason you would do that would be due to some of the capital that would need to go into Neary to maintain it as a school moving forward. So one of the things that became very crystal clear was the need to know if the schools were willing to give up a building, not only which building is it, and we've narrowed that down to Neary or Woodward. We've already taken a motion and voted out Finn and Trotter from our analysis. I can walk through those two reasons in a second. But if the schools were to walk away from Neary or Woodward and be able to consolidate or do something with one or the other, would the town actually be able to use that space to deal with all of the other needs that we've all talked about, whether it be senior center, whether it be a new space for the superintendent, additional space for the townhouse staff, recreational space, youth and family services, especially if South Union is no longer part of our inventory. Like, how do we actually want the space, right? And has anyone actually looked at the space of what it could accommodate or non-accommodate? So what we're going to talk about in a second, I'm going to pause for questions first, is whether the committee wants to engage an architect to walk through those two schools, Neary and Woodward, to give us some initial thoughts of how much could actually fit in there based on the space that some of those departments currently occupy or may need to occupy in a future state. So I'm going to pause there before we go into like a robust discussion about the need for that, just to see if anyone needs more details of where we're at.
Jason, one thought I had when you were talking earlier about, the schools, whether or not if the study comes back, we need, we really should have 4 versus 3. I think adding the possibility of expanding, if expanding Neary or Woodward, but I don't think there's any land for Woodward, but really expanding Neary. If the study comes back and it's like, okay, we need like 1/10 of Woodward, maybe it looks at expanding Neary along with the renovations that need to be done there, and then, getting rid of Woodward. So I think that scenario wasn't really what you talked about, but I think that might be a scenario we need to look at of how, if we need 4, do we need 4 or do we need, 3 1/4? In that case, do we expand Neary, kind of a scenario?
To that point, it goes, right, what we're also starting to realize is it goes beyond just enrollment, right? As everyone knows, there's about 2 grades per school until you get to Trotter in Southborough. That's not necessarily what most other communities have. So what the superintendent and his team have also been tasked with at the same time, and actually school committees meeting now, and they're going to be discussing some of these topics tonight, is, what are there educational benefits, regardless of what the enrollment tells you, are there educational benefits to maybe having less transitions between schools and, kind of setting the stage for the future? Because if we do anything to Neary, Andrew, it's readily apparent just based on their capital plan without even doing an addition or anything else, there's going to be significant capital just to maintain it, given it is circa 1950s with obviously a few additions, in the meantime. So I think one of the critical questions is going to be, is that the right spot for a school, like in terms of that actual building? Or, there have been some proposals thrown out there of, are we going to have to maybe start from scratch on that site? Or, what's the campus approach look like, et cetera? So I think that will go into the options that we will think about, but I don't think enrollment's going to be the only factor here. I think that we thought we started that way, right, Kathy? But I think it's become abundantly clear to make a pitch to the community. You obviously have to have some hard facts, but you also have to be solving a lot of other things at the same time, regardless of what path we decide to go down.
Yeah.
Can I add something there, Jason?
Sure, go ahead.
I think it would be helpful for everybody to know a little bit of history. So when this was done in 2013, the committee that reviewed the 4 versus 3 schools was much larger than the committee Jason and I are on. 3 times as large, probably 15 people on it. Even though the conclusion of that study was that based on the projected demographics, we could close a school 3 or 4 years from then, the decision was made by the school committee not to do so. And the main reason given for not deciding not to go forward with that was the concern that if the demographic projections were wrong, we would have to reopen whatever building we were going to close. At that point, we could only close Neary because the debt was still, there's still too much debt to be paid on Woodward, and we would lose our state reimbursement if we closed that one. So there was no question as to which school would be closed in 2013. And then the fear was that the cost of reopening Neary, if you had to, would be enormous, given all of the ADA work you would have to do to retrofit it. So they just felt that the risk was too great to close a school back then. Today, we have the choice of the 2 schools because by the time we start on this, the debt for Woodward will be paid off. So we're not in danger of losing any of the 37% reimbursement we get from the state for the construction cost. So we've got a little bit different scenario this time. And last time, the committee did not look at what the town might do with the shuttered building. It just wasn't part of what we looked at. This time, it's the impetus for doing this, is that we think, which is what our job is to determine whether we do need a building. We could really use the building for the things that we think would be a better use of it than what we have for where various town departments are, et cetera. So it's a little bit different focus this time. And so we do, I think, need to have a robust determination as to what we would do with one of the 2 buildings if we were to take it back to the town, which is where Jason's going to right now. Because to me, that's the driver for doing this. The schools didn't come to us and say, we want to close a school. We may want to close a school. Can you figure this out for us? We went to them and said, we think we should look at this again. They agreed, which was great, to work with us on looking at this. But the impetus again is to that we think we've got a use for one of these buildings.
Are there any other questions thus far?
I have one, Jason.
Go ahead, Lisa.
So you talked about having the formal study done and the option of hiring an architect now. Is it too soon to hire the architect now based on we don't know what the study's going to show? Should we wait until we get that in? Are we putting the cart before the horse? I mean, obviously you and Kathy have sat in on these conversations, so.
So I think there's a few things to consider. I think cost will be part of it, and we'll get to that in a second. Okay. But before we get to cost, right, and we just think about like, are we wasting anyone's time, right? There's a very defined timeline and process for MSBA, which is ultimately who we need we need to fall in line with their timeline, and they're obviously not going to wait for the town of Southborough. There is a timeline that would open up in the February timeframe with responses due in and around May. That's using the timeline that they had last year. It could, based on feedback from the superintendent, it could shift a month or 2 here or there. But during that timeframe, not only the school committee, but Board of Selectmen are going to need to make a decision of whether they actually approve the statement of interest and what that is in that statement of interest. So if you play through a few scenarios, the schools get the enrollment study and it kind of reaffirms where we already thought we were going to be, which is where we had decreased enrollment over the last 10 years, but it's flat over the next 10 years. Then you kind of know what you need from a space perspective, and Greg and his team are actually going to start to do floor maps now, right? They're not going to wait for the enrollment study of like how, if we consolidate the schools today with the enrollment that we have today, what it would look like and how on top of each other they were. One of the important things in all of this is the school administration for both the Northborough and Southborough public schools, including Algonquin, occupies about 7 classrooms right now in the Neary school. That's approximately equal to 1 grade. So doing the right. So there's going to be a lot of iterations that they're going to be able to play around with, but these things are so intertwined. And if we as a town can't say, oh, we really have a good use for Woodward, or we really have a good use for Neary, it's going to take the schools down a very different path, potentially, when they get the enrollment data. And they're not going to have the luxury of then saying, okay, town, now you spend 2 months thinking about how you would use it. So this allows us a chance to, it may end up being a waste of time, but I'm pretty optimistic it's not going to be a waste of time, because I think, as we all know, for those of us that worked through the last major capital project this town took on, it wasn't one population that was supporting it. It was many populations. And I think regardless of what the schools need, short-term or long-term, regardless of what the seniors need, short-term or long-term, regardless of recreation, if we can get this thing to all mold together, we've just charted our capital plan for the next 10 to 20 years in one swoop, as opposed to many different pieces. So that's, I think, why we're bringing forward now. And many, I don't know how many follow when I post the agendas versus distribute them, right? This was a late minute add. I added this after the subcommittee met last week, because the superintendent, the school committee member, on that committee also thought that this question needs to be answered to kind of help inform some of their thinking once we get this in January. It started, to be completely honest, is I wasn't that familiar before last week with the footprint of some of the schools. I can look at a map and figure it out, but I actually walked through the 3 schools in question, and it became abundantly clear to me how certain spaces could be used, or what certain spaces may need to be scrapped and started all over, depending upon what you're going to use it for, right? And I just think the more people that do that, especially, I'm not a professional in that area by any way, shape, or form, the more ideas the town will have about what needs we may be solving. On the flip side, we may find that we're not actually going to solve more than 1 or 2 constituencies' needs. You may find, you can solve seniors and recreation, but then the building's mostly full, or this or that, right? And you would understand the limitations of the space you may or may not be working with, but also what sort of upgrades would be needed or not be needed based on the space that you take over.
So Lisa, we're talking, I think, fairly short money. We're talking about an architect that's familiar with, hopefully, not only schools, but maybe public buildings too, that can basically walk with us and point out things that we wouldn't see ourselves. Make sure we don't go down a path that makes no sense. And he may be able to say, you can't do this, you can't do that. So we're not talking about, a schematic here. We're talking about some help in just looking at the buildings initially, telling him what our ideas are generally, and getting his feedback on what he thinks about each one of them.
No, I appreciate that, Kathy. I was just trying to follow the process, and
Yeah.
that
No,
seemed
go
out of
ahead.
sync. So I get it now. Thank you.
So Kathy, you mentioned 10 years ago that you said Neary was not ADA compliant. Is that what you said?
It's definitely not ADA compliant.
So if we were to repurpose it for another group in town, would it have to then become ADA compliant? Is that something you guys have talked about?
Jeff, I don't know, probably. If you spend so much money on a building, you've got to make it ADA compliant. So we might have to make it ADA compliant no matter what we do, whether we reconstruct, if we spend a lot of money, what we spent on Neary over the last few years has stayed below the threshold that triggers it, but I don't think we'll stay below it this time. And the school's 50 years old. If we want to last around the 30 years, we're going to spend some money on it one way or another. So we may not be able to avoid that this time, Jeff.
Okay.
And just to be crystal clear, this committee is responsible for, and this is what the schools are looking for from this committee, is in a repurpose, what would you have to do? they're going the subcommittee that Kathy and I are on are focused solely on how do you use these spaces for schools, right? Which is why there's now basically a referral back to this full committee to start working on this side work stream while the enrollment study continues. So I guess, Jeff, your question would be answered by the six of us, not by the work Kathy and I are doing.
Okay.
So before we go into cost and potential vendor, does everyone understand the basic premise for why we're bringing this forward? So the easiest thing for me to do was I reached out to Jeff Shaw, who Kathy and Mark know very well. Lisa, you may have interacted. He was the architect of record in his firm for the public safety building. They do a lot of municipal type buildings. I would say they don't do a lot of schools, which is why I exactly just made the clarification I did, because we're not asking them to look at redesigning a school or building a school. We're asking them to look at think about it as a municipal building and a repurpose of space. And I just asked for a sanity check of exactly what we just talked about. Walk through these two buildings and basically give us a memo on the types of things that you could see it being used for and how much of that space could be used for. We're falling short, though, initially of an actual floor plan with like, this would be where Mark could potentially have a new office. This could be where the superintendent has a new office. This is where recreation has an office, right? But really just giving us the framework to move forward with. That cost to do that exercise is a number that is not north of $2,000. So I'm building in a little bit of, I'll call it contingency. So I think there's two questions. One, is that a good use of $2,000? Two, because we didn't have to go out to bid or do a formal RFQ process, we went to one person. But that one person is very familiar, honestly, with the Woodward site. I don't think he's ever looked at the Neary site in any way, shape, or form. And he's familiar with the town. He's familiar with the intricacies of how this town operates. And I think we need to all be aware of that every town has its own unique character of how it approaches something. And I think a vendor understanding that is already a step ahead. But I'm not wed to going that route. We can go and solicit other people that may be better, more experienced. But I think we're in the elementary stages of this. And I don't think we're at a point where we're designing anything. We're not cutting down walls. We're just trying to get someone, because none of us are architects last time I checked, to just look at the space that isn't wed to any one opinion. I don't know if anyone has opinions yet or not, but right, that just can come in fresh and say, do this, don't do this, can do this, can't do that. So
I would add to the reasons for doing this with him is that we know him too. We know him well and have a lot of faith in him.
I would say unless there's somebody that knows the architecture of the school any better or the town, then it makes sense. And it's not, I don't think it's huge money. And that's why we have the budget we have this year to do this kind of work.
I agree with Andrew.
Is there like a de minimis threshold for what needs to go out to bid? Because it seems pretty immaterial, $2,000, but I don't know.
Mark?
So anything under $25,000, requires, you to get basically 3 written quotes. The formal bid process is pretty high. Anything under $10,000, Jeff, is considered best business practice. So you're well within that range right now to go with someone like Jeff Shaw, if that was the choice.
Mark, have we solicited all the departments to see whether or not they'd have any interest in any of the properties for any use besides the South Union departments?
I don't think I've been that presumptuous yet to see what we
Be careful
may.
what you wish
Yeah,
for there.
Well,
Yeah,
but I think it's-
I don't want to get in the way of the, the work of the committee. We can make those outreaches, as soon as, we get some level of comfort that the committee, has a path.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, I know we talked to youth and family, we talked to rec and so on and so forth, say, if you left South Union, what would you need? I'm just thinking, if we had either of these properties available, are there other departments in town that, would be better served there, or have other thoughts of how they could use the property that we could include those in our, requirements definition for the architect?
I think that's a little premature, Andrew. I think we've got a good enough idea among this group as to who they might be without opening it up. So I wouldn't do that yet either.
All right, my only concern is that we're then gonna have to do it again. If we say, okay, it's Woodward and rec and youth and family and youth and whatever takes, and senior center can only use, 50% of the capacity, is it worth it? And then we look for other takers that might want some of the
I
space.
can assure you, if those are the three departments you were looking at, and you add in the superintendent's office and they occupy the same 7 classrooms, you will have plenty of space in either one of those facilities for other constituencies. Does anyone disagree with that? That knows those buildings?
No.
And
I'm sorry, Jason.
Go ahead, Mark,
I'll just make one comment, to Andrew's point. I think obviously if, you were to assume one of the 2 buildings, we're obviously going to want to dispose of as many other buildings as we can. I think the one building that remains in our portfolio regardless is going to be the townhouse.
Yeah.
So it may make sense, can you fit everything from South Union and from Corderville and from the townhouse and the superintendent's office all into a Woodward or a Neary? Probably not. But there is, it does make sense, to keep some offices and things like that in the townhouse. Maybe it makes sense that you put all your building and planning all in one building type of thing. So like I said, I think that there's going to be some shifting sand until we really get a good idea as to space needs and what makes sense. And at the end of the day, the important thing is what properties can you dispose of? What's the trade? We get this and then we lose this and this. Public safety, we get a great trade. We built a brand new public safety facility and we ended up at the end of the day getting rid of 3 of our oldest buildings. Fayetteville wasn't part of the deal, but 3 of our oldest buildings are now gone. So I think we've strengthened our portfolio that way. You just look to do the same thing again this time.
Yeah, the building department was the one I was thinking of, whether or not we want to include that, and get rid of Corderville or looked at that.
Yeah, I think you're going to say something, Kathy?
Yeah, I'll be quick. So Mark, I agree with you that I am assuming the townhouse, we're about to spend a lot of money in the townhouse. The townhouse is the townhouse. It doesn't go anywhere. I would add to that probably maybe the library too, some expanded version of it. So maybe those 2 are the ones that still stay and everything else is up to for discussion.
No, I agree. The library building, I'm sorry, Lisa, the property is, really, we keep that regardless, whether library has an expansion or whether they look for a completely new building. I think that location is something you don't let go of.
Well, indeed, it has library too, which is part of the problem.
Right.
One other, I think.
And Kathy, because Mark interrupted Lisa, so I just want to make sure.
Sorry.
Everyone's fighting for air time.
No, just a quick thing too. I mean, in talking about the library too, I mean, if Woodward, and again, the big if, you could do a nice little annex of a library there. If you're certainly servicing youth and family recreation and or seniors, the opportunity to do an annex that would fit their needs as well and might help with some of the expansion that they might need. So that's all.
There's a beautiful library already there.
There is.
Sorry, Kathy, go ahead.
So one other fact to keep in mind, one of the things that the subcommittee will probably end up doing we're going to get this report that's going to give us a probability of what the student population is going to look like for the next 10 years. By the time we get this project done, if we do it, 3 years are going to pass. So now we've got projections that only go 7 years. So to make sure, again, we end up with not a problem with not having enough school square footage for the future, we will probably also build in a contingency so that we would be able to expand if we had to down the road. There's only one school. Woodward's, I thought Neary was bigger than Woodward. It's not. Woodward's apparently a little bit bigger than Neary square footage wise, but Neary's got more room to expand than Woodward does. So keep that in mind too, as far as how we talk about this. We got septic system issues we got to deal with too. So there's lots of moving parts with this.
And for everyone's benefit, the Woodward septic system is brand new with the public safety building. All right. And then I would just say on the enrollment stuff, Kathy and I aren't going to bring all of that back. It's a lot of detail, but if you're curious, there was some really interesting trends that we saw of where the numbers were off and where they were on over the last 10 years. So we'll have to summarize that at some point when we come back to the joint school committee and capital planning committee here with some recommendations of where to go forward. But what I would ask of this group, before we kind of motion on the actual proposal here, is that, if you have ideas or things that you want to see, like as a voter in this town, we want to know those sooner rather than later so that we're encompassing them into our report. And that's what Katuro is now doing with the school committee as well, is we don't want to have to go in like 10 different directions because we get 10 different sets of questions come January, February. We're trying to have answers to as many questions as feasibly possible to come up with a path or paths for people to choose from, but not have 10 unopened questions that someone's like, how did you not even think about that sort of thing? So I would just ask that as you think of things, as you roll through things, Andrew, like to your example of the expansion, right? Just throw those things out there because it may, if you kind of watch our last meeting and as we were going through a step plan, it kind of expands where you want to go. But I think the general consensus from the school administration side, but the membership on the committee was, we'd rather get those questions answered now as opposed to kind of getting blindsided at a public meeting in the future where we're trying to make some critical decisions.
Yep.
One more thing on the engineering report or whatever we're going to call it. Are they going to only walk through Woodward and Neary? Is that the plan?
Yes. And let me explain why not Finn and Trotter. Is that your question?
I was going to ask about it for potential expansion of Finn as well. If we were to keep that and, keep, say hypothetically Neary and Finn, but expand on Finn. Is that a possibility?
So
it doesn't mean that we can't put a grade at Finn, Jeff, even with the current footprint right now. We've got Northborough renting space from us for their pre-K. So there's room at Finn. So one of the, if you go back to 13, one of the different permutations we looked at was taking one grade. We had basically 4 grades, right, that we were trying to see how they would fit. So we actually put one at Troutier, one at Finn. So there was different ways we did it. So it wasn't just combining the 2 schools together and getting 4 grades. We moved them around. So Finn might have room for one of the grades. It would have room for, if it were a grade, it'd be 2, right? So Finn is not out of the question as far as absorbing a grade.
But Jeff, to be clear, as part of this initial discussion that we're having tonight, the reason he's not going to go to Finn is we're not asking him to tell us where we can add on to schools. The sole purpose of what context architecture would be asked to do here is how would we repurpose a school for municipal needs? That is the only question that they will answer in their report. The schools, right, this is where division of labor is going to be crucial to make sure everyone has it covered. The schools, as part of the broader planning, and this probably won't be for a year, will likely be looking at where you could add on if you had to. I think, but common sense tells you Finn is a very flat parcel, and where Neary is a very flat parcel. right? So versus Trotter and Woodward, significant grading sort of issues. And obviously Woodward is pretty much landlocked at this point. And just for everyone's, the reason we're not looking at Trotter is because of the function of the building, right? The intent would never be to move, at least from our understanding, another grade up there from like what's already existing near, just based on how middle school operates versus elementary school. And the reason that you would never, Finn would not be a candidate for repurpose. It's actually a very basic one. I didn't think about it until the superintendent said it, was the bathrooms. In all the spaces and the countertops, they're really low to the ground. So you'd have to do a pretty large gut and renovation to make any use, functional use of the space, regardless of the population using it, unless you're using that entire building for children under the age of 7.
What a committee thinks sometimes is driven by the people on it at that time. So the last committee was chaired by Linda Murdoch, who Lisa probably knows. Of course, Mark, I don't remember Lisa. Linda Murdoch. Anyway, she chaired it. She was the principal of Trotter. And they did propose moving the 5th grade up to Trotter. Greg Martineau, the superintendent today, is definitely not in favor of that. So again, you've got different people that have different views as to moving a 5th grade up to Trotter.
So I guess the what we're looking for from the committee tonight, and I'll make a motion to move the conversation, is to authorize Context Architecture to spend no more than $2,000 to do an analysis for municipal purposes of the existing Woodward and Neary schools. Is there a second?
Second that.
Any discussion? All right.
I just say,
Roll call.
I
Go ahead.
haven't had a chance to tour the schools since I went there. So maybe when the architect's there, I can go around with you guys.
So there are issues with access, as you can probably imagine, with COVID. So I'm not going to answer that question tonight, but I will add those. Let's vote, and then I want to come back to how we get people up to the same level playing field on the buildings. So, is there any discussion on the motion?
Yeah, but I'm not sure if I missed this. The use of the funds from the committees.
From the committee's fund, that's the only funds we have access to.
Okay.
It wasn't in my motion. Sorry, it was somewhat implied. But
That's what I meant.
thank you for
Okay.
clarifying.
You should put it in there, though.
Yeah. Is there any further discussion? All right, roll call. Braccio,
Aye.
Cook,
I
Hark,
Aye.
Palmer,
Aye.
Taff,
I
and Malinowski is aye. So that's unanimous. Now to Andrew's question. I will take that back to the superintendent of how best to accomplish this. We went on a remote day when I took a walk through. I also need to think through whether it's a separate walkthrough or whether we do it with the architect. My fear of doing it together with the architect is open meeting law and the potential for deliberation purely by accident of, hey, what about this space? What about that space? So I will come back to the committee with a plan of how, you need to be able to see the space for you to be able to accept whatever he brings back. So does everyone need to take a fresh walkthrough? See, Lisa's shaking no. Kathy?
I would have said no, but I'm going to say yes now. I actually haven't been there in a long time,
Okay.
at least Neary. So I actually would like to refresh my memory.
Jeff?
I have not been in Neary. I've been in Woodward a little bit.
Okay.
So
And Joe?
I've been in both quite a bit, but I'd still like to go.
Okay. All right. Let me figure out the best way to do this. And I will report back to the committee. And then,
I'm not sure if it's an open meeting issue if you only speak to the architect. That makes sense? Like the only questions asked are of him. And he answers and the group hears. That make any-
Dangerous.
Yeah, I'm not comfortable as I think I can make that
Any,
decision.
any guidance on that?
Too many
We-
arguments in this town, Andrew, so just.
This is such a crucial decision for the town. We're gonna dot our i's and cross our t's, right? Because it's something easy for someone to go out. Even right, no one's gonna. It creates more questions than answers sometimes. So the key is we will facilitate access so that people can walk through. It actually may be better on a day when the architect isn't there, but I will report back so that we're okay, because otherwise we have to post a meeting and have people, yeah. I will figure out a plan and report back.
So to be clear, we've got $35,000 in the capital committee study budget. The only thing we've used so far is the appraisal for South Union. Is that true?
Yes, and ClearGov.
Okay, so, and that's what, almost five for the appraisal and less than,
It was 6 and just north of 2,500 for 6 for the appraisal.
Okay.
Just north of 2,500 for ClearGov.
so 85.
And 2,000 for this. So we still have over 25 left, if my math, or right around 25 left, maybe 24. Yeah, 24.
Because the demographic study is coming out of school budget.
Yeah. All right. So I will report back on access. A lot of it is going to go around timing of when context comes out and how they facilitate that. And I want them to be independent in their view so that we're not preconceiving any sort of notion there. Anything else in the schools? All right, I'm going to go to members report. My intent with this section is if anyone has any relevant updates. I know, Andrew, you have been off and running with recreation. Joe, you've been off and running on certain items on trails. But obviously, if anyone has any broader updates that we haven't discussed or aren't a separate agenda item to use this time. So I guess, Andrew, anything you want to report back?
I'm still working on stuff there, but nothing to report yet.
Okay. I guess a question for you is they were talking about potential additional capital items for this year at their last meeting. Have you had any conversations with them about that?
No, I watched the meeting. And nothing really bubbled up too much, more just philosophical things. So,
Okay.
but I need to talk to Tim and see if anything has concretely come up that they need to present here that we didn't talk about yet.
Okay. So they, just for the record, they were notified of all the deadlines that have
Correct.
since passed.
Yeah, I think the other thing is, the question is whether or not they're thinking is they'll use the revolving fund and they don't need to necessarily come to us, but we should establish that precedent.
Well, I think we can talk about that with the policy in a little bit. Anything else in recreation, Andrew?
No.
Okay. Joe, anything on trails or anything you were working on?
No, I haven't heard anything from them yet, so I'll check in with them.
But they did submit a CPA application, is that correct? To
Yes,
Community preservation?
they were. Yes, that was their intention, and but they hadn't solidified that as of yet. So
Okay.
I'll check back in with them and see where they are.
Okay. Any other members have any reports? All right. We were going to skip number 6 based on the discussion earlier this meeting, which puts Lisa. You're on mute, Lisa.
That doesn't happen often. I don't get muted often. Let's see if I can.
To be clear, you muted yourself, right?
I did. Okay, let's see if this works.
Well, Lisa brings it up. I just wanted, I think that the level of effort that went into this before she even says a single word about it, I think should be commended. There's obviously a ton of detail that I'm anxious to hear more about, but just wanted to thank Lisa for taking this task on. And obviously she has a ton of familiarity with the land in town and spent many years on open space. So just wanted to thank her for her efforts in advance of the actual presentation.
Thank you. So the first thing I did as I was going through is I went to the assessor's office and asked for a starting list of town-owned properties. The list you see on your screen, there's actually going to be 3 pages. This included initially land, buildings, and recreation. So there's a second page, there's a third page. So that's where I started at, going back and forth between the 3. So what I did was my focus obviously was on land. So as I went through each of those items, some were deed restricted from a conservation restriction, some were restricted via a subdivision approval. I had analyzed all of the deeds that were on there, and a couple are currently under the care and control of conservation. So where I ended up from the 3-page list was this list of properties here. And as you notice, most of these properties were by tax taking, other than the old dump, the stump dump, which was at the old public safety building. So this is the first property. It's 0.78 acres. The blue here that you see is actually wetland that's tied into the map. This is the parcel itself. You'll see there's very little upland there. And one comment on these tax taking parcels as well is they were typically left over from a subdivision for one reason or another. You know, they were unbuildable and the developer, for whatever reason, just let them go. Some went through the full tax foreclosure process. Some, the finance team was able to work with town council and the developers and just have them turn over. So it actually shared, saved the town some expense. So this is one of the parcels. So here's another parcel. It was left over. It's 2.48 acres, and it actually abuts the Sudbury River on one side and the railroad tracks. It's all wetland. So there is no upland on this parcel. This one, actually it's 2 parcels together. I'm going to show you this parcel first and then this parcel. But just for reference, this is actually a soccer field that was done through the Liberty Estates. So it kind of gives you an idea of a little bit of the value potentially. You'll see there's very little access on this parcel. It's through a easement through shared driveway. I think there's like 10 feet. It's a very small amount. This is the second parcel. This is the parcel we just looked at. And you'll see this parcel was done by tax taking. It's right off of Vale Terrace. So there's a little bit of connectivity there, except the majority of your frontage is subdivision open space. This was deeded through the open space. And you'll notice the purple, even down here and here, these are collars. These are part of the subdivision requirements for open space. So, so both of those parcels do have a little bit of issue. But again, I think there's some value with the soccer field there. The next 2 parcels, these were taken at town meeting 2 years ago. This is a paper road. This road is not actually built. So it's this full parcel here and this full parcel here. This stream is a tributary to the Sudbury River, and it runs right through where the paper road would be and comes out on the other side. And you'll see the wetlands. So again, there's an access issue to some degree here because you can't get to the parcels. And here's a better look at one of the parcels. You can still see the paper road here. And you'll see it's protected with the open, wetland and the stream. And this is the other parcel here. And you see there's just a sliver of access that's outside of the wetland. I did had the opportunity to walk these 2 parcels before town meeting took them. I would say from maybe this point on is upland. All this, you have to walk up a hill to get to it. One of the things that's happened over time is a lot of the kids that live in these, the subdivision around this, you see there's a swing connected to one of the trees, a rope swing. You know, you can see where kids have actually gone in and made use of it for whether just to walk through or had made little trails through there. This parcel, I'm sure everybody's somewhat familiar with. You can see here's the transfer station here. This is where it comes around and where all the recycling is done. This parcel is 9.46 acres. One of the things I did was, because it's listed in pink, which is a municipal open space. So I had talked to a few people, including the assessors, and there was some question that at one time when the deed was done going back many years, that there was a restriction put on it. I went back to the deeds to the 1800s and I couldn't find any restriction. So I'm not sure if that's a mistake. That's something the assessor was going to work on to see, because I couldn't find anything.
So Lisa, go back to
Yes.
that one. Where's
Yes.
the transfer station?
So here is the hopper, and then here's where you go around, and this is where you do your recycling, and this is where the swap shop would be. So a portion of that is already in this parcel.
So is this the land we were talking about when we were still debating on where to put the public safety building?
That's correct,
Yes.
for the police, yes.
Yeah, it
It's
can
off
only
of
be used
Middle
for
Road.
police.
Yep, off of Middle Road. Is that it, Kathy?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. This little parcel here in the gray, this is protected open space. This is over by Chestnut Hill Farm, and this is the aqueduct, so that's protected. For the aqueduct, there's a 200-foot riverfront area, so there's not a whole lot that can be done with this parcel based on the widths. It's very narrow. I think it's 150 feet wide. So again, it was 1.8 acres, and it completely abuts the aqueduct and the trails. And this is the old stump dump from the old public safety building. I know, I'm trying to be careful what I say about this. I know St. Mark's didn't have an interest in it. So the town does still own it. I guess I'll just leave it at that for now. And this parcel here is on the Pinecone, Waterview Terrace, and Maple Crest. It was unperkable at the time when the development went in. And since that's happened, the neighbors have a form of an agreement with the DPW that the kids use it as like a park. The bus picks up there. They've maintained it for quite a long time. The neighborhood maintained it. I know the DPW just went in and did some tree cutting there in the last year based on a request. So that's 0.72 acres. So as you can see, most of the parcels we discussed were left over from subdivisions that had little value. Excuse me for 1 second, sorry. Sorry about that. Okay. Most currently these parcels sit under the direction of the Board of Selectmen. There's 3 options for us to potentially offer to the Board of Selectmen at this time: to put them under the care and control of the Conservation Commission, any that are deemed as best suited for open space and or recreation, to further analyze them for any value for future needs as the town retains ownership, or potentially to auction to reclaim some of the expenditures already realized. So that being said, does currently, just for reference, Breakneck Hill is has a CR on it, but it's also under the care and control of the Conservation Commission. It just gives a little bit of added protection on parcels that we know may have a, from a conservation standpoint, wildlife habitat standpoint, might be the most suited for it. So, are there any questions? Would anyone like me to go back to any screens?
Why are you specifically bringing up Breakneck Hill?
Well, I was trying to think of, Kathy, when I say putting it under the care and control of the Conservation Commission, I was trying to think of parcels that may have been under that. Because
So,
it does.
in other words, that's an example of what number 1 would be.
Yes.
That land is already dealt with, in other words.
Absolutely. I was just using it as an example to, for instance, let me just go back to this parcel here where we talked about the paper road and, you know, the value in protecting the wildlife and the environmental, the wetlands. So this might be a parcel that, you know, the committee might feel might have a value to be under the care and control, you know, to continue to protect that resource. So that was the only reference. I was just trying to give you an idea of some other parcel that may have been under the care and control of Concom.
Hey, Lisa, on that one, before you go,
Yep.
is there any parking near there?
No. So unless you did on-street parking, when we actually, Jason, went and walked it, we actually parked on Heather Lane. Let me see if I can get down to the paper road. If it doesn't. So we actually just parked on the side of the road here, kind of off people's driveways. Woodbury is very narrow. There is no parking whatsoever there. And that's really the only way to access it is from one of these two spots. This year, we actually had to climb over the stream when we came out on Woodbury. So, again, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, you could certainly do some type of trail or something in there. Jason, over behind Ted Lane further back, there is some other protected land. I didn't actually put it on here. I could have, but it's over in this area over here. There's no connectivity though to
Okay.
it. So that's what I kind of came down to. These, out of all the parcels we started with, that's kind of where we ended up. And as you'll see, most of them were taken for taxes because obviously the developer felt there wasn't a whole lot of value to the parcels.
I had a question. Is the old stump dump right next to where St. Mark's put in all those panels?
Yes.
Pretty close.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's right there.
Is there any chance of turning over the land for some sort of purpose like that and selling off the power to, say, Newton Street, health facility? I mean, I don't know if there's still any state or federal credits that can be done now, but with the new administration coming in federally, they might renew what used to be. Because I know when I had panels put on my house, I got a third from the federal government. And if they revive some of those solar incentives, since already panels right next to it, it might make sense to turn over and do the same thing, just make a bigger solar field, but sell it to the other side.
Well, to be able to benefit from that, you got to be a taxpayer. Solar credit is going away pretty fast.
We could certainly, is it zoned for that purpose? Because we could certainly make that an advantageous site for somebody to do that.
I don't have an answer for that, Joe. We certainly something that we could look into. This is the one site out of all of them I'm not as familiar with.
Don't know anything at all myself, so.
Yeah, this was the only one I could talk a blue streak about all of the other ones, but I know that this site had some challenges, which is why St. Mark's didn't include it in the land swap.
Well, they did to begin with, and then they did
Right.
the due diligence and gave it back.
Yeah, exactly. I was trying to find the best way to say that.
What were the big obstacles that they found that they didn't
Let's
like?
stop there.
Yeah. So anyway, that being said, so again, something for maybe not for today, but just to think about and consider is what a recommendation on some of these parcels may be, where the value really is. Is it in, I would think if you were looking at something to hold on to, obviously this makes the most sense, for future town use at some point. But a lot of the other parcels are small, they're wet, they're contiguous with other open space. Again, here, this is all protected.
Lisa, on this one here,
Yes,
is that buildable? It looks about the same size as the house next door.
it's actually, I don't know if I can,
I mean, you can't say whether or not it obviously has to go through whatever zoning or.
yeah,
whatever.
but there's protections on it, Andrew, because this is a resource area. Typically on the aqueduct and the rivers, there's a 200-foot riverfront area. So I don't know based on that. I think it would be challenging, which is obviously why it came back. I mean, there might be some value to, someone that abuts it, or, even solve for, I don't know, but it's certainly challenging.
Is it fair to say we don't do a lot of maintenance on any of these?
Correct. Actually, we don't do, let me just go back. I don't believe, Kathy, other than, so obviously we don't do anything on this because it's all wet. This is all wet. There's no maintenance. It just sits there. Same as this. I know that there's some kids that, that walk through between them. That's the other piece of it. That's the paper road. There's no maintenance in here at all.
So you walked every one of these, Lisa?
I walked the majority of them. This one, because especially, I'm very familiar with this because I spoke at town meeting about this one. I walked with conservation and the assessor and Brian Ballantyne and the Concom agent. You know, before we went through the formal process of taking it, it didn't go through the full foreclosure. You know, the developer was willing to basically walk away from it. I mean, the taxes weren't paid, but, you know, the town retained ownership without actually having to go through the final foreclosure process and the cost that would have been involved in that.
Are we in danger of ending up with another Breakneck Hill problem on any of these where people start dumping stuff on them?
I don't believe so. Now, this was the most recent one and we rocked this. The only thing that we saw was a little bit of grass cuttings, like right along the border, you know, which I think is, and I can't even say because again, it wasn't, you know, like the survey stakes weren't there, but you could kind of see where the backyards ended. But there was no debris that we saw in here at all, other than some trees that had fallen, which is kind of normal in these situations. Let me just go back up. So I've walked again. This is all wetland. You can see this. This is right down from the old fire station 2. That's like across the street and it's all wooded and you can see it's wet and it abuts the trains. And again, I have walked through this a couple years ago. Again, it's wet. It's sensitive. And again, we just talked about this one and this one. I haven't walked this one, but years ago, I know that Open Space had looked at it and it was in, I believe it was in the Mass Audubon report, but I know that, again, it was looked at when it was being looked at for the police station. This, I drove by it, Kathy, it's wooded. There's no maintenance going on there, no maintenance going on at the stump dump. And like I said, the only maintenance really going on here is the neighbors maintained, they mowed it. You know, it was like a little pocket park for the neighborhood and for the kids. And the DPW went in and just cut back some of the brush that was kind of on the sides, kind of going over. That's really the only maintenance that's been done on this site. And that was done within the last 2 years.
And you said the only reason it wasn't built on was because it couldn't perk?
It didn't perk. That's what I was told as I dug into it. Yeah.
Lisa, remember the parcel a couple years ago at town meeting that was controversial? It was one, I can't remember where it is. Actually, I can't remember where it is. Where the neighbors actually had built on it. They put swings and et cetera stuff. So they, of course, didn't want it to be upset. Did that one ever get resolved?
I don't know the answer on that one for sure, Kathy. I know there was a few that have come forward that there were issues on things being built in the open space and whatnot. I believe that most of them have been because conservation was involved in those and that's not on their radar, I believe, any longer. I mean, that's something certainly we could follow up on, but I believe that the majority of those have been resolved.
You've done a beautiful job on this.
Well, thank you. I've just walked a lot of these, so. All right, so that's it. I'll stop sharing if no one has any other questions.
I think, Lisa, my only question is, what are the next steps here?
So, I mean, I think a recommendation, you know, because they are town-owned properties, you know, I think it falls within capital, you know, to give a recommendation of what our thought is for the best use of these parcels. And again, like I said, you know, whether to just auction them and you know, see what happens, or, you know, I personally would like to hear from Concom to, you know, get their thoughts on these parcels as well. Because again, because of the resource areas in relation to the wetlands and some of these, I think it has a value there. But again, I'm one of how many of us that sit here. So I think just for us to think about, Andrew, you know, what might be the best use of some of these properties and you know, give some recommendations. And Jason, you can probably, I don't know whether you agree that these fall under capital to make a recommendation on.
I would think so, because it's, and that, like, we focus so much on buildings, right, to start.
Yeah.
And we had this on the radar screen in terms of land, and asked you to go off and do this. So, you know, it's obviously tremendous work. So I think, if we end up taking no action or recommending no action, I think we just need to say why.
Yeah.
And I think then if someone says, well, what is the town doing to look at their current assets? Is there any revenue to be had out there that, but I think maybe going off in speaking, with conservation, Andrew, I think in your conversations with recreation, I would definitely think, the more creative juices, I'm going to be the last one to join that party. But the more creative juices that can be used here to think about different uses, or whether there's a value that hasn't been thought about in the past, let's at least advance it. It may go nowhere or it may go somewhere, but you don't get anywhere without trying.
And Jason, maybe a conversation with, even having open space and or trails look at these as well. There might be some value in those.
So open to the thoughts in the community, because that's a couple of different committees or commissions, et cetera, that would be involved. We can invite them to one of our meetings. We could send a representative off to talk to each of them at one of their meetings, or we could just have a representative email the chair of that committee and start the dialogue and see if they even think it rises to a public meeting discussion or how they want to advance it. Those are the three avenues I can foresee here. I would lean towards nominating someone here to go off and at least liaise with, and it could be multiple people. You have one talk to trails, one go talk to recreation, one go talk to conservation and open space. I think those kind of go together.
Yep.
That's kind of how I would separate it, but I'm not wed to that.
Perfect, Jason. And, I would say, I don't mind going to rec, and I think Joe's got a good relationship with trails now if he wants to present those properties to them. And then, I don't know, Lisa, it sounded like you could go talk to Concom, and then we're good.
Yeah,
And
Concom and open space.
Yeah.
I was on it
Okay.
for 15 years, so I think I'm probably a good one to go talk to open space.
All right. Does anyone have any objections to that path forward? So what I will do is I will keep this on the agenda. We don't have to have an update at every meeting, but that way we're covered should someone have any developments or thoughts around it. Is there anything else on Lisa's presentation?
The only other question, Lisa, I know some of the properties that have open space or some of the subdivisions where they had big piece of property. Did any of those have, they have some restriction for open space, but they have, recreation language in there that you could use it for recreation or certain things? Or I was looking at the Atwood property. I don't know if you looked at that one at all, but trying to understand what the restrictions are there, but I couldn't really find much besides just open space.
So they're deeded, Andrew. Part of the subdivision process, if it's over X number of units, there's 10% up to 35% or more of open space required, and it has to be protected as that in its natural state.
Natural state, okay.
Natural state, yeah.
Perfect.
So not to belabor this, but very quickly, in my neighborhood on Pine Hill, there was a requirement to set aside so much as open space. The developer picked the person he wanted to have control, the entity that was going to own the open space. So he did that. My neighborhood went to that person and said, can we have it? And he said, yes. So we took over that entity and then turned it into a beautiful garden that generated 1,800 pounds of food for charities this year. It's got beautiful places to go meditate and walk your dog. It's got all kinds of wildflowers. So that may be a model for some of these properties. It's not necessarily what the town was suggesting that we do, but I think it's worked out really well. So I'm hoping that there's others that will mimic what we did here.
Okay. The other thing I'll say before we get on, this was purposely labeled town-owned parcel. I know there has been at least chatter, and I think you can see it in some of the master plan about parcels the town doesn't own, but maybe should own. I would just ask the committee to be cautious about discussing that in a public general session meeting. To the extent that you want to discuss one of those, let Mark and myself know, and we'll figure out whether it falls within the boundaries of executive session. Because I think when you're talking about purchasing something, and Mark, feel free to weigh in here on any of this, we don't want to jeopardize the town's bargaining position if we've kind of given the current owner any sort of heads up. So I don't know, Mark, if you have anything to add on there. I just want to set the rules of the road now, because I know that has also come up at certain points.
Yeah, no, I think that's accurate, Jason. The only thing I'd add is that sometimes when the town indicates that they're interested in purchasing a piece of land or property, the owner of the property all of a sudden increases the price because they know the town's interested. The town may have deeper pockets than some other people who are potentially interested. So yeah, normally it's better to keep those discussions in executive session so that you don't jeopardize your position.
All right, I'm going to move on from that to draft capital planning policy. Let me give you a little background on how this came together, and then we can talk about specific comments. I'm probably just going to do around the horn, unless anyone has any objections to that. But I circulated 4 towns' capital plans and policies. They all had very different formats to them, as you probably could tell. And I also tried to think about what uniquely we have talked about as a committee in our, 7 months together. And I also tried to lean on at least my experience and Brian's experience, or like what issues have come up in the past, or what issues we'd like to see greater transparency around. So some of these things will look very similar, as you probably could tell, to other towns. Some of them are very unique to Southborough. And I think this is a start. It's marked draft for a reason. It's really based on my initial draft and Brian's initial draft and bringing them together. So we can completely gut it and start from scratch. We can accept components. We can move it forward in any different way. Ultimately, we can recommend a policy, but the BOS has to adopt it. My goal is to not rush it, but at the same time, get them something sooner rather than later. My view is that if we have components that we absolutely are in agreement on, we should at least get that ball rolling with the BOS. We can certainly submit revisions at later points. I'm not sure how many there will or will not be. That will be up to the committee. But I do think formalizing some of this, going to Andrew's point earlier about use of revolving funds, process, what we're expecting to see, will help to guide some of these big decisions that we have, coming in front of us in terms of how you prioritize things and bring things together. So if everyone's okay with that, what I would suggest is we just do around the horn. We can go alphabetically, or someone can volunteer to start, and then we can see where we're at the end of it to decide how we want to proceed tonight. Do you want to go alphabetically? All right, Lisa, you're up.
Okay, so I think this is a great first start, Jason. I saw a lot of things in here that I don't necessarily would change. As far as questions, I was still in the process of going through all 4 of the towns. So I'm just gonna say that I think this is a really great first start. And as I was going through this, I didn't find anything that I didn't necessarily support.
Okay. Kathy?
I have not spent the time on this that I need to, so I'm not going to add anything to this discussion. I need more time.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. Jeff?
Yeah, I'm pretty much in the same boat as Kathy, where I haven't had a chance to go into it in too much detail. But I would say that it's, a really good start, and appreciate you taking the time to do it, Jason and Brian.
Joe?
I really wanted to thank you for not making it the exercise and torture that the Nantucket plan was. Because that one was really not a lot of fun to go through. I went through most of it. I think there were a few things that, looking at a couple of the other towns in terms of their prioritization process, might be worth looking at later as to whether we feel we need that kind of a process or if we feel like we may come to that kind of a process at some point. But I do agree that I did, outside of some of the terminology and maybe even using a little less specificity in terms of how definitions we're using for certain things. I did like the format that you used, and I like the general guidelines. But I can easily just send you the edits that I made and see how you felt about
Don't
them.
do that,
Okay. I
because that's deliberation outside of a meeting. So we'll talk about process in a second.
All right. Sorry. But yeah, I mean, they were limited edits, and for at this point in the process, since it's going to be re-edited several times, by going through BOS and coming back, I don't think that that needs to be done at the moment.
Okay. I would like Brian to address your comment on prioritization. Brian, if you're comfortable doing that, because I know you felt pretty strongly about that. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think it'll give the committee, especially those that haven't had a chance to look at it, a chance to form a view as they move through it. You're off mute, Brian, but I can't hear you if you're talking. Still nothing.
While he's finding the mute button, one thing I would suggest is that in terms of the things that we're going to list under capital, I might add financial instrument as well as tangible asset and project, because at some point the town may consider a financial instrument in the capital category.
So can you give an example just for everyone's benefit of what you mean by that?
If you're buying an annuity or something that acts in a financial instrument type of way where you're buying an asset that then pays you, that might be considered a capital asset. Does that make sense? And I'm not thinking about the fact that it would happen, but the eventuality that it may happen within the town at some point. Some lease structures would act differently as capital assets when you place them on a balance sheet, as opposed to a liability. I'm just saying that being inclusive of financial instruments would be a step forward for future guidance in terms of where people were classifying capital assets and how we dealt with capital assets. Does that make sense? I can't be necessarily that specific because I haven't seen them used in this particular regard in any recent times, but when you're shuffling around, balance sheets in public and more in private, there are lots of times you use financial instruments as assets. And so if we're purchasing a capital asset, do we consider purchasing a financial instrument as a capital asset? And I personally think that there are some situations where you would.
I don't know, Joe. I think I would think that's outside our bailiwick. I don't think you're talking about looking at ways to finance the purchase of a tangible capital asset, which is what I think is really under our purview. So I don't know that looking at purchasing some type of investment asset is something that we are being asked to do.
And I would say if we are asked to do in the future, you can always amend.
Sure.
Jason, what do you think?
You asked me, Kathy? I mean, my view is no, we're not being asked to do that now. And I'm open to the fact that things can change, but when I think about financial instrument, I probably think about it the way, Kathy, you think about it, the way Jeff thinks about it in his world, and the way I think about it in my world. And I haven't seen that in municipal finance yet. Doesn't mean it never won't come in, right? Because never say never. But I would think if something like that appears, this policy could be updated as opposed to adding it in now. It would maybe misconstrue maybe some of the things we're looking at least at this point in time.
But Joe, I don't want to bat this down unnecessarily. Brian Ballantyne is the treasurer, and I just look at it as his purview to make decisions like that. He's the one that decides, what banks we use to deposit our excess cash, et cetera. He's the one that leads the effort to determine when it's time to float permanent.
Oh, you
bonds.
don't have to worry. I'm not going to fight for it. I was just suggesting it.
So I guess, Brian, let's close out the financial instrument, and then we'll come back to the original question for Brian on prioritization. Can we hear you now, Brian?
Can you hear me?
That's better.
So yeah, no. So yeah, the prioritization, my point with that was that, we had some comments about CPC not being looked at, and, obviously the goal is not to have things fall on the tax levy. So, my thought was obviously grants, CPC, other revolving funds, whatever we can do to lessen the burden on the tax levy is sort of the goal.
I don't want to interrupt you there, Brian, but I just want to make sure. Joe, were you asking about the prioritization around like immediate threat to health and safety, preservation, or operations, or were you asking prioritization about how we do funding sources?
I was merely addressing the fact that other towns had put in some structures by which they evaluated different
Like
items.
surveys, yes.
And so how they prioritize them as opposed to how we were going to do it. But just that, if you had to choose between A and B, some of the towns had scoring systems as to how they did that. I'm not sure that I liked some of them, but that may come up and people may ask our reasoning as to how we did it.
Yeah. So Brian, take that one.
Yeah, no, Jason, I agree. And I think I made a comment to you on this, that I'm not sure I like the scoring system. There's something about it that I just don't know. I'm not totally comfortable with it, but I do agree that there is a ranking that you can make for, obviously public safety or, mandates from the state, other items that, would require a higher prioritization. So I think we absolutely in a policy you should have some of that. I don't know if I'm comfortable, and the board will have to decide this, but I don't know if I'm comfortable with a 2 or a 3 or a 4, some direct scoring system that a couple of the communities had. But, again, you're going to have to look at some type of ranking, which makes sense. I'm totally with that. And, my experience has been communities have put in, like I said, obviously health and human safety is number one. So, and then you go down and, rankings such as, mandates and other things like that obviously buildings that will save you money in the long run, other things like that are important. So again, not something to be solved tonight, but something to think about is how you rank the projects. Very useful, but I just don't know if the scoring, I did see one community that had particular scoring, and I don't know. Something about it was just.
I agree with you.
I don't know.
I agree with you. There were a couple forms that I saw that were troubling to me, but at the same time, if somebody's asking you why did you get why did this person get a sidewalk but we didn't get a playground? It's
right.
Those sorts of things that at some point somebody's going to ask us, well, where are the priorities? And in doing so, it's not about I totally agree with you. There were some that was I looked at the form and I said, if you work this out, this doesn't work out well. But at the same time, we could prioritize, like you're saying, safety. So that would be a higher priority in the hierarchy versus another one of the priorities. And in that way, I think we could provide a prioritization system that would work to be advantageous to the way we want to make decisions.
Absolutely. And my opinion is Jason did a great job as the first stab on this. It's a big policy, and it's an important policy because, my thing is, and I'll put my 2 cents in, is I'm still big on like a capital stabilization fund. I've always been, and we've never got there. So hopefully the committee can consider that and, you know, all the ramifications of that. But I know some communities that do it and it works really well. And some of the challenges we're going to have in FY22 would have been alleviated if we had thought of that years ago, in my opinion. But yeah, so it's a big decision.
So Brian, on that point, if I put that topic on the agenda for the next meeting, we'd be ready to kind of walk through some thoughts on that?
Is the next meeting tomorrow or
2 weeks.
No.
2 weeks.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
I would
Again,
push
not
back.
something that's going to be solved in one meeting, but I think you and Mark educating on what you've seen in other municipalities, and if you have a vision for where this committee may go, and then start taking feedback from us, we can figure out the right path forward.
I would also remind everyone that we have had a vociferous, robust discussion about stabilization fund levels. It's been a while, 2010, but we did. And we've got a nice white paper that was written to basically discuss it. So we have talked about this a lot. We didn't talk about a capital stabilization fund. We just talked about the overall stabilization fund, and we brought it down from many millions of dollars to what it is today, which is $600,000. So we're not starting from scratch here as far as a thought process behind that. There's a lot of thinking that's already gone into that. So we can regurgitate that and talk about what we've looked at in the past too. I think it would be helpful.
Okay. Joe, anything else?
The rest of it was just language where I would have changed some of the wills to shoulds, only to release certain people that are doing certain jobs from being attacked under the policy, where where you should do this, but where it's not absolutely necessary. So if you say that you will, then you're locking that person into a plan of action that they might then be attacked for. If you need an example,
I just did a quick search. There's 12 wills in the document.
yeah, like under process, there were a couple of wills there where if you change them to should, it's a little bit kinder to the person that's doing it, so they know what they should do. But if that doesn't make sense, they're not responsible for going through the motions just because.
I agree with you, Joe. I think from my world, and probably Jason's as well, should and will are pretty much the same thing. But yes, I think it's a kinder way.
Yeah, it's just if somebody goes, hey, you were supposed to because it says you will, as opposed to you should, which gives you a little bit more leeway to say, well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there are some wills that will stay, at least in my opinion. I
might eliminate a few of the monetary figures, just because if you're locking yourself, for instance, useful lifespans of less than 10 years and cost less than $350,000. Figures like that tend to lock you into situations where people will say, well, why did you touch that? When maybe it was pretty obvious to the committee as why you did, but under the guidelines, maybe you shouldn't have. Some of those I might change just to give the committee more leeway in the future to address items that they want to address, and maybe not address them if they don't feel like it or feel like it's in somebody else's purview. Those are the only real issues that I had. Small potatoes. Overall, I like the direction you took, and I like the way it's laid out.
Andrew?
So I thought it was great. A couple small things that I just want. So on the definition, I don't know if we want to add some language along like, so it's $10,000. Is that per fiscal year over the lifespan of the useful life? So maybe just clarify that.
Do you have a view? I guess do you have a view on what it should be?
I think it should be over the life. My only thought process is like maybe, say something like the tasers that we lease. So the fiscal year cost, maybe it's, $9,000 a year, but we lease them for 5 years. So it's really, a $45,000 expense. Probably something we should look at. So I just, I wanted to add some language there so nobody could game the system by just deferring the payments.
Okay.
And then the only other one, I think on the on the prioritization, I think adding one of revenue generation or self-funding, like say we purchased another ambulance, that would increase our ambulance revenue and kind of pay for itself.
Okay.
Something like that. Or if the rec commission wanted to do something that added a program that allowed them to increase their revenue or something. I think that's a prioritization level.
Okay. Any other comments from the committee? We think ready to discuss tonight. So what I would like to try to do is vote on something to bring forward to the BOS at our next meeting, so 2 weeks from now, and then let them take it from there. Obviously, they can send it back to us if they don't like it, etc., but at least advance the ball based on what I'm hearing from at least the members that had some time to look at it. Obviously, if you come back and say we need to start from scratch, then we'll discuss this as a committee and go from there. Does that goal sound reasonable? All right, so now Joe definitely has edits. We've heard Andrews. So what I think is probably best is if individual members have proposed edits, send them to Mark and Brian. Mark and Brian, doesn't mean you have to make the edits, but I'll leave it to you to find someone that maybe can put it into one version for the committee to review. And obviously, if there's a conflict, we'll look at both. I'll take responsibility to bring it up both on the same screen next time, and committee can vote for person A or person B's edits. Does that seem like the right approach?
Why are we in such a hurry for this? I mean, I'm just being selfish. I haven't had a chance to look at this, and I want to weigh in.
Well, I'm giving you 2 weeks.
Okay.
I don't know. Is that not enough?
No, it's probably enough, but it still doesn't give us a chance to look at the revised, edited document as a group. But I'm not going to hold this up. If that's what everybody else wants to do, that's fine.
I mean,
I think, Jason, you were saying at that next 2 week meeting, we'll look at those edits.
yeah. And
I thought you were saying you were going to get it to BOS in 2 weeks.
No, we're going to meet. We're going to meet. We're going to meet in 2 weeks. We'll look at the revision.
Fine.
Right.
I'm fine then.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to the BOS in 2 weeks. Okay, fine.
No. It's going to fall wherever it falls in the BOS's schedule, right? It's not going to be like a special meeting or anything like that. It's going to be sent to them for discussion at whenever they can fit it on their agenda. But I just wanted to, and we may say we're not ready because maybe there's a point in here that we're split on, right? There's only 6 of us.
I apologize. I didn't understand.
Okay. All right. So what I would ask is if you have edits, to please try to send them to Mark and Brian by next Monday. So that at least gives people time to look at whoever's going to compile it for them, time to compile it, and then send it back to the committee in time for a meeting 2 weeks from tonight. Mark and Brian, you're on mute, so I've committed you. Push back if that's not reasonable.
That's fine by me.
I'm good with it if Brian's good with it.
Okay. And if for whatever reason it gets delayed, we'll just push it to the next meeting. But that's, I guess, how we'll leave that for this evening. Item 9, ClearGov review and feedback. So Brian and I have been working with the vendor. There's candidly a slight, I'll call it, flaw in the ability to produce capital reports at this point. I think she referred to it as I don't remember how she referred to it when I asked her about it, Brian, but it would be a waste of everyone's time to walk through it tonight because it's showing FY20 data. We're well beyond FY20 at this point from a capital perspective in particular. So we will bring this back to the committee when it's ready to kind of do a walkthrough, and we'll grant access when it's actually ready. Because if you went in there, you take 10 steps backwards before going forwards. It's honestly how I would put it at this point. they are working on it. So I have full faith that they'll find the resolution. I think we're asking questions that they haven't seen yet. I will say though, what I'm going to do is figure out a way to PDF. We basically need to figure out what form we want department heads to submit their capital request on in the future, and in what level of detail, which goes into hand in hand with kind of this policy. So as you know, in the past, right, a department head put a thumb in the air and said, I don't know, I'll pick on the fire chief, right? Fire truck will cost X amount 10 years from now. I know I need one every 20 years, right? But there's no data behind that of why, right? So, having the reference to NFPA standards, for example, which would govern how he gets to the 20, like what data do we want them submitting for us to actually be able to evaluate it, right? And coming up with a form, that is going to be something that's going to take a while. The good news is we have basically a whole fiscal year to come up with it. But what I will do is figure out a way to get everyone the form as it exists now, which is based on the existing template. And I think what everyone needs to start thinking about is what they want to see when the next round of capital items come before us, like to actually be able to stand behind it and support it. Because what we want is a submission in advance, so we don't have to have as many meetings with these department heads like we had over the past 6 months. That was kind of to get caught up to speed. But now the documentation, which then would be public, should stand on its own. So the justification's out there well before we have to vote. So you'll see something on that. It'll be probably a standing item for a while, but that's something I don't think it has as long as it needs to be as expedited. Any questions on ClearGov? I think it's in a much better spot operationally, Brian, right?
Yeah, no, and I think you make an important point here. This form that you're gonna create for certain items is really important, and it's gonna force department heads to, or guide them in the direction that the data you want. So, I think Jason, you've seen some examples of some of this and from other communities, and it's been very interesting seeing, for a vehicle, how the data that they're requesting is, given back. So I would take a little time on that and definitely make it worthwhile to set it up right.
Anything else on ClearGov? All right. Any public comment? Is there any other business?
I had a question for Lisa pertaining to the presentation. Are we allowed to forward that to other committees for the look over? Or should we just be talking to them about the parcels that we're talking about?
No, Joe, I think you can forward it. I don't think there's no reason not to. Absolutely.
Thanks. That'll make it easier.
Okay, so our next meeting is 2 weeks from tonight, same time. And obviously I will let everyone know in the meantime if I have any details related to schools walkthrough. I can't imagine it will happen in that 2 week time frame, but I need to understand what the timeline is going to be of the architect now and when they're going to be able to furnish something so that everyone can get in.
And maybe winter break would be a good time frame. I don't know if that's too late.
Yeah, I'll kind of do 2 work streams, one with the superintendent, one with the architect, and figure out how the schedules align or not.
Tomorrow night, are we being? Should we enter the same link we did for the last BOS meeting?
I'll go in this. Just go to virtual meetings on the town website, and then whoever's running the meeting will have to manually let you in.
Okay.
Sorry, I should have. That is truly the next meeting. The next public meeting is 2 weeks from tonight. Okay, I will make a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Joe. Any further discussion?
Yes, when are you sending the draft?
In 30 seconds.
Okay,
It's literally, I have it ready to go.
okay.
So I had a second. Roll call. Braccio,
Aye.
Cook,
Aye.
Park,
Aye.
Palmer,
Aye.
Pfaff,
Aye.